They called me the family failure. Then the court read Grandpa's letter. I was 34 years old the day my mother looked me in the eye at my own father's funeral and told me I didn't deserve to sit in the front row. I want you to sit with that for a second because I did too. I stood there in my black dress, holding a folded program with my father's photograph on the front, the smell of white lilies thick in the air, and my mother, dressed in her perfect charcoal suit, leaned close enough that only I could hear her, and she said, "The front row is for family who actually showed up for him. Go sit in the back with the neighbors." I didn't argue. I never argued. That was the thing about being the family failure. You learn early that arguing only confirms what they already believe about you. So I walked to the back pew, past my brother Marcus in his tailored suit, past my sister Renee dabbing her eyes with a tissue she'd probably bought specifically for the occasion, and I sat down next to a woman named Carol who used to bring my father soup when he was sick, and who, unlike my own siblings, had actually visited him every single week for the last 2 years of his life. That's the part nobody in my family ever wanted to talk about. Who actually showed up? My name is Eleanor. Everyone calls me Ellie, except my mother, who only ever called me by my full name when she was disappointed in me, which was often. I was the middle child, sandwiched between Marcus, the golden boy who became a real estate developer and never let anyone forget it, and Renee, the baby of the family who married a man with old money and somehow convinced everyone that manicures and charity luncheons counted as a full-time job. And then there was me, Ellie, the one who dropped out of law school in her second year to take care of our father after his stroke. The one who moved back into the small house on Maple Street instead of chasing a career. The one who, in my mother's words, never amounted to much. I want to tell you about my father first because none of what happened later makes sense if you don't understand who he really was underneath the surface my family showed the world. My father's name was Walter. He was a quiet man, the kind who fixed things with his hands and rarely raised his voice, even when he had every reason to. He ran a small hardware store for almost 40 years before he sold it and retired, and even after he sold it, men would stop him in the grocery store to thank him for helping them rebuild a porch or fix a leaking pipe 20 years earlier. He remembered everyone's name. He remembered everyone's kids' names. He was, by every account except my mother's, a good man. My mother, Diane, was different. She came from a family that had lost its money 2 generations back, but never lost the manners that go with money, and she spent her whole life trying to reclaim a status she felt she was owed. She loved my father the way you love a house, for what it provided, not for what it was. And she loved Marcus and Renee the way you love an investment that's paying off. Me, she treated the way you treat a bad decision you can't undo. I don't say any of this looking for pity. I'm telling you because you need to understand the family I grew up in before I tell you what happened after my father died. Because what happened after is the kind of thing that would make you doubt human decency if it weren't for the ending. And I promise you, this story has an ending that will make you exhale for the first time in a long while. My father had his first stroke when I was 29. It was mild, all things considered. His left hand shook for months afterward, and he lost some of the sharpness in his speech, the words arriving half a beat late, like a radio signal that had to travel farther than it used to. Marcus visited twice that whole year. He was busy, he said, closing on 3 properties, and besides, what could he really do? He wasn't a nurse. Renee visited 4 times, always for under an hour, always managing to turn the conversation to herself within the first 10 minutes, always leaving my father looking a little more tired than before she arrived. I moved in 3 weeks after the stroke. I quit law school. I didn't tell my mother right away because I already knew what she'd say, and when I finally did tell her, she said exactly what I expected. She said I was throwing my life away for a man who could have hired a nurse. She said I'd always been the dramatic one, always needing to make myself the center of some sacrifice nobody asked for. She said, and I remember this word for word because it cut me in a place that never fully healed, "You were never going to make anything of yourself anyway, Eleanor. At least this way you're useful for something." I stayed anyway. Not for her. For him. The next 5 years of my life were built around my father's mornings and afternoons and slow, careful evenings. I learned how to help him into the shower without making him feel like a child. I learned which of his old records calmed him down when the frustration of not finding a word got too heavy. I learned to read the particular silence that meant he needed a break from talking, and the different silence that meant he just wanted company without conversation. I gave up an apartment in the city, gave up 2 relationships that couldn't survive the schedule I kept, Gave up, if I'm honest, the version of my life I thought I was supposed to be living. And in exchange, I got something I didn't expect. I got to know my father, really know him, in a way I don't think Marcus or Renee ever did. I got the stories about his own childhood, about the shop he built from nothing, about the year he almost lost the store, and how a stranger named Harold co-signed a loan for him because Harold said something in Walter's face reminded him of himself at that age. I got to hold his hand during the second stroke, the bigger one, the one that took him from a man with a slight tremor to a man who needed help getting dressed every single morning for the last 18 months of his life. Marcus visited once during those 18 months. Renee visited 3 times, and each time she cried more than my father did, which even at the time struck me as strange, this need of hers to make his decline about her own grief before he'd even died. My father passed on a Tuesday morning in March with my hand in his, the way I'd always hoped it would happen if it had to happen at all. And 4 days later, at his funeral, my mother told me to sit in the back. I told myself it didn't matter where I sat. I told myself grief doesn't have assigned seating, that my father knew who had shown up for him and who hadn't, and that was the only ledger that mattered. But something in me, something small and tired, wondered if maybe my mother was right. Maybe 5 years of my life had bought me nothing but a back pew and a folded program. I had no idea, sitting there next to Carol smelling those lilies, that in 6 weeks I would be sitting in a courtroom, and everything I thought I understood about my family would come apart like wet paper. The mystery started the way most mysteries do in families like mine, quietly in a lawyer's office, over coffee that nobody drank. 3 weeks after the funeral, my mother called a family meeting to discuss what she called, getting the estate sorted before the lawyers make it complicated. I remember that phrase specifically because it turned out to be the first lie in a conversation built almost entirely out of them. We met at her house, the one my father had paid off years earlier, sitting around the same dining table where I used to do homework as a kid. Marcus brought a leather folder full of what he called preliminary figures. Renee brought her husband, Chip, who I'm fairly certain had never met my father more than a handful of times but seemed very invested in the conversation nonetheless. My mother explained in the calm, reasonable tone she used whenever she wanted something and needed to sound like she wasn't asking for it, that the house on Maple Street, my father's childhood home, the one he'd inherited from his own parents and where I had been living and caring for him, would need to be sold. The proceeds, along with his retirement accounts and the money from the hardware store sale years earlier, would be split fairly among the 3 of us, minus what she called reasonable compensation for herself as his surviving spouse. I asked carefully what reasonable compensation meant in numbers. My mother said 60%. I looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at his folder. Renee looked at her nails. I said that seemed like a lot, and my mother said, in a voice that had gone cold in the particular way I recognized from childhood, that I wasn't in a position to question anything, given that I hadn't contributed financially to the household in 5 years. I opened my mouth to say something about the 5 years I had contributed in every way that actually mattered, and Marcus cut me off, saying we should let the lawyers sort out the technicalities, and that we should focus on what Dad would have wanted, which was for the family to stay unified. It was such an ugly, hollow thing to say, coming from a man who had visited our dying father exactly once in 18 months, that I almost laughed. I didn't. I sat there and I felt something I hadn't felt in years, not since I was a teenager, watching my mother favor Marcus and Renee so openly that even their friends noticed. I felt the specific quiet fury of being erased in real time by people who had barely been present for the thing they were now dividing up. But here's where the mystery begins, the part that would have stayed hidden forever if not for a single sentence my mother said almost as an afterthought while gathering her papers at the end of that meeting. She mentioned, almost too casually, that we didn't need to worry about the old will, because my father had updated everything years ago, and the new arrangement was much simpler. I didn't think much of it in the moment. But that night, lying awake in the guest room of the house I now technically had no legal claim to, that phrase kept circling back to me. The old will. What old will? My father had never mentioned a will to me, not once in 5 years of long afternoons and honest conversations. And if there was a new will that made everything much simpler, why hadn't anyone shown it to me? The next morning, I called my father's longtime lawyer, a man named Frank Whitaker who had handled Walter's affairs since before I was born. I asked carefully if he could tell me anything about the will. There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that tells you someone is choosing their words with unusual care. Frank said he couldn't discuss the details over the phone, but he asked me to come into his office. Alone. I sat in Frank Whitaker's office 2 days later, in a leather chair that smelled like old books and older secrets, and Frank slid a manila folder across the desk toward me with the careful, deliberate motion of a man handing over something he knew was going to change everything. He told me that my father had come to see him 8 months before he died. Alone. Without my mother. That detail alone made my stomach tighten, because in the last 2 years of his life, my father almost never went anywhere alone. He couldn't drive anymore after the second stroke. Someone had to have taken him. Frank told me that my father had asked him point blank to draft a completely new will, one that would replace the version my mother had referenced at the family meeting. A version, Frank explained delicately, that my mother herself had pushed my father to sign nearly a decade earlier, back when his health was still good and he trusted her instincts more than he probably should have. That old version left the bulk of the estate to my mother, with Marcus and Renee receiving generous shares and me receiving what Frank called, wincing slightly as he said it, a token gesture. But the new will, the one Frank had drafted 8 months before my father's death, was different. Very different. Frank explained that my father had shown up at his office that day with a manila envelope of his own, thick with documents, and had said something Frank told me he'd never forgotten. My father said, "I need you to help me make sure the truth doesn't die with me." I asked Frank what was in the envelope. Frank said he couldn't show me everything yet. Some of it would need to come out during probate in front of a judge, the way my father had specifically wanted it to. But he could tell me this much. My father had spent the last 2 years of his life, in between the moments I thought were just quiet afternoons and record albums and stories about the hardware store, quietly gathering evidence. Bank statements. Photographs. Letters he'd written but never sent. A ledger he'd kept by hand, the ink shaking more with each entry as his condition worsened, documenting things about my mother, about Marcus, about Renee that none of us, least of all me, had ever known. I asked Frank why my father hadn't just told me directly. Frank looked at me for a long moment before he answered. He said my father was afraid that if he told me while he was alive, my mother would find a way to talk him out of it, the way she talked him into things before. He said my father wanted the truth to come out in a way that couldn't be undone, couldn't be smoothed over with one of my mother's calm, reasonable conversations at the dining table. He wanted it to come out in a courtroom on the record where it would matter. Frank told me the will named an executor other than my mother, someone my father trusted completely to make sure his wishes, and the evidence behind them, would actually see daylight. He told me that executor was me. I left Frank's office that afternoon holding a copy of a letter my father had written and sealed, addressed to the judge who would preside over probate, not to be opened until the formal reading. I held it in my hands the whole drive home, resisting the urge to tear it open right there in the car, because some part of me understood even then that whatever was inside deserved to be revealed the way my father intended, carefully, deliberately, in front of everyone who needed to hear it. That night, I finally understood why my father had asked me, so many times over those quiet years, to help him organize old paperwork in the study. I had thought I was just helping him pass the time, sorting through decades of receipts and letters because his hands shook too much to do it alone. I hadn't realized I was watching him build a case. The weeks that followed were the strangest of my life, because I had to sit across from my mother, from Marcus, from Renee, at increasingly tense family dinners, knowing something they didn't know I knew, watching them discuss dividing up an estate that was about to be pulled entirely out from under their assumptions. My mother, in particular, seemed almost giddy in those weeks, already talking about downsizing the Maple Street house into something she called more manageable, already dropping hints about a cruise she wanted to take once everything settled. Marcus started talking more openly about a development deal he needed capital for. Renee mentioned more than once a kitchen renovation she and Chip had been waiting on the right moment to start. I said nothing. I went home each night and I read through the small stack of documents Frank had allowed me to see early, given my role as executor, and slowly, painfully, I began to understand exactly what my father had spent his last 2 years documenting. The first thing I found was a series of bank statements showing transfers from my father's personal retirement account into a joint account he shared with my mother. Transfers my mother had initiated using a power of attorney she'd had drawn up shortly after his second stroke, at a point when his ability to fully understand financial documents was already significantly diminished. The transfers totaled just under $200,000 over 14 months. When I cross-referenced the dates with the ledger my father had kept, I found his own handwriting beside several of the entries, shaky but legible. Did not authorize this. Diane says it was for medical trust. Have not seen the account. The second thing I found nearly made me put the folder down and walk away from the entire situation. It was a series of photographs, developed at a drugstore and dated almost 2 years before my father's death, showing a storage unit my father had apparently rented under his own name without telling anyone. Inside the unit, according to the photographs and an itemized list in his handwriting, were pieces of furniture, jewelry, and a small collection of paintings that had belonged to his own mother, my grandmother. Items my mother had told the rest of us years earlier had been sold off to cover medical expenses after my grandmother's death. My father's notes on the list simply read, "Diane told everyone these were gone. They were never gone. I moved them myself before she could sell them." The third thing, the one that finally broke something loose in my chest that I'd been holding tight since childhood, was a folder of report cards, school photos, and a handful of crayon drawings, mine from when I was 7 or 8 years old, along with a single typed letter and signed that Frank later confirmed had been written by my mother to a marriage counselor she and my father had briefly seen when I was a child. In it, she described me, her own 7-year-old daughter, as the disappointing one, unfortunately, though I try not to let it show. My father had kept that letter, folded inside a manila envelope, for almost 30 years. I sat on my bedroom floor that night and I cried in a way I hadn't allowed myself to cry since the day of the funeral. Not out of sadness exactly, but out of something closer to vindication mixed with grief for the little girl who had spent her whole childhood sensing she was unwanted and being told by everyone around her that she was imagining it, and vindication because my father, quiet, steady Walter, had apparently spent 30 years noticing everything, saying almost nothing, and, finally, in the last years of his life, deciding to make sure the truth outlived him. I found more over the following weeks. A property deed showing that Marcus had convinced my father, back when Marcus was just starting out in real estate and still 18 months from his first successful development, to co-sign a loan using the hardware store as collateral, a loan Marcus never fully repaid, quietly absorbing nearly $80,000 of my father's money into the down payment for what would become his first profitable property, all while telling the rest of the family, for years afterward, that he'd built his career from nothing with no help from anyone. I found records of Renee's wedding, an event I remembered as tasteful and modest, costing, according to what she'd always told people, not that much, honestly. My father's own handwritten notes, cross-referenced with actual vendor invoices he'd apparently requested copies of years later, put the true cost at just over $90,000, quietly paid for using funds from what was supposed to be a joint retirement account, funds Renee had always claimed she and Chip covered entirely themselves. There was a smaller detail I almost missed, tucked into the back of the same folder as the wedding invoices, that ended up matching more than I expected. It was a handwritten note, dated almost a year before my father's death, listing out, in his increasingly unsteady hand, every single visit each of his children had made since his first stroke. Not an estimate. An actual tally with dates. Marcus, 2 visits in 5 years. Renee, 11 visits, most under 40 minutes. Eleanor, he'd stopped counting after the first year, writing simply, every day, or close enough that counting stopped meaning anything. Seeing my own name in his handwriting like that, seeing him quietly keeping score not out of resentment toward the others but simply because he wanted an honest record somewhere, undid me more than any of the financial documents had. I also found a smaller stack of letters my father had written to me directly, over the last several months of his life, that he'd apparently never worked up the nerve, or perhaps never found the right moment to actually hand me. They weren't dramatic. They were ordinary in the way that made them devastating. A few lines about a memory from my childhood he wanted to make sure I still had, a line thanking me for a specific afternoon I barely remembered, a line telling me he was proud of the person I'd become, law degree or not. I read those letters slowly, one a night, rationing them the way you ration the last of something you know you'll never get more of. Piece by piece, document by document, I understood what my father had been doing during all those long afternoons I thought were just quiet retirement. He had been building a case. Not out of bitterness. Frank made this very clear to me more than once. My father hadn't wanted revenge. He'd told Frank in almost those exact words that he simply wanted the truth to exist somewhere permanent, somewhere no one could talk their way around it, because he'd spent his whole life watching my mother rewrite the family narrative in real time, and he was tired of watching me be the one erased from every version of the story that mattered. The probate hearing was scheduled for a gray Thursday morning in April, in a courtroom that felt far too ordinary for what was about to happen inside it. Fluorescent lights, scuffed linoleum, the low hum of an old air conditioning unit that couldn't seem to settle on a temperature. My mother arrived in another perfectly tailored suit, Marcus beside her in a tie that probably cost more than my monthly rent used to be, Renee clutching Chip's arm like she expected to need physical support to make it through the proceedings. I sat with Frank at a separate table, as the named executor, my hands cold despite the overheated room. I remember small, useless details from that morning with a clarity that still surprises me. The way the courtroom clock was 7 minutes fast, the way someone 2 rows back kept clearing their throat every few minutes, the paper cup of water Frank set in front of me that I never once touched. I remember thinking absurdly that my father would have hated the fluorescent lighting, would have made some quiet comment about how nobody ever thinks to fix the bulb that flickers, and the thought of him noticing something so small in a moment so large almost made me smile in spite of everything. The judge, a woman named Judge Alvarez with a calm, unhurried voice that reminded me a little of my father, began by confirming the will's validity, walking through the standard legal language of testamentary capacity and witness signatures. My mother's lawyer, she'd hired one the moment Frank informed her of the new will's existence, objected almost immediately, arguing that my father had been of diminished capacity when the new will was drafted, that he couldn't possibly have understood what he was signing given his condition. This was, I would learn, the opening my father had anticipated most clearly of all. Frank stood and requested the court's permission to enter into evidence a series of documents my father had specifically prepared for this exact objection, including a full neurological evaluation performed the same week the new will was signed, definitively establishing my father's mental competence, along with a video recording, made in Frank's office with a court-approved witness present, of my father explaining, calmly and clearly, exactly why he was making the changes he was making. The judge allowed it. I watched my mother's face as the video began to play on a small screen wheeled into the courtroom. My father's voice filled the room, slower than it used to be, occasionally reaching for a word that took an extra second to arrive, but unmistakably him, unmistakably clear. He said, "My name is Walter Bennett, and I am of sound mind, whatever anyone might claim otherwise once this recording is watched. I am changing my will because for 30 years I stayed quiet about things I shouldn't have stayed quiet about, and I don't intend to stay quiet about them any longer, not even after I'm gone." He went on methodically, almost gently, to describe what he called a pattern I should have addressed decades ago. The financial transfers, the storage unit, the loan to Marcus, the wedding funds, all of it, laid out in his own unhurried voice, without anger, without cruelty, simply as fact after fact after fact. And then he said the thing that made my hands finally stop shaking, the thing I hadn't known was coming, the thing that made Renee gasp audibly beside her husband and made my mother's perfectly composed face crack for the first time in my adult life. He said, "My daughter Eleanor gave up 5 years of her own life to take care of me without ever once asking what she'd get in return. She never asked because she never expected anything, and that, more than any amount of money, tells you everything about the kind of person she is. I am leaving the majority of my estate to her, the house on Maple Street, my retirement accounts, and everything recovered from the items my wife told our family had been sold, not because I love my other children any less, but because Eleanor is the only one of the 3 who never once made me feel like a burden." He paused on the recording, and I remember that pause more clearly than almost anything else in my life, because in it I could hear him breathing, could hear the particular rasp that had settled into his lungs in those final months, and I understood that he had recorded this knowing it might be one of the last clear things he ever said. He finished by saying, "Diane, if you're watching this, I want you to know I forgave you a long time ago for a lot of things. But I couldn't leave this earth without making sure Eleanor finally got to hear, in a way she couldn't dismiss or doubt, that she was seen, that she mattered, that I noticed everything, every single sacrifice, every single visit, every single year she gave up to sit with an old man who couldn't always find the right words to thank her properly while he was alive." The courtroom was silent when the recording ended. My mother's lawyer tried, weakly, to raise another objection about undue influence, suggesting I might have somehow coerced my father into making these changes. Frank calmly produced a statement from the independent neurologist confirming my father had met with him alone, without any family members present, and had been assessed as fully competent, with no signs whatsoever of external pressure or manipulation. Judge Alvarez upheld the will in its entirety. I didn't look at my mother during any of it. I didn't need to. I could feel Marcus shifting uncomfortably beside her, could hear Renee's quiet, stunned breathing 2 seats down, could feel the particular stillness that settles over a room when the story everyone believed for years finally collapses under the weight of the truth. Outside the courthouse afterward, my mother caught up with me on the steps, her composure only half rebuilt, her voice lower than I'd ever heard it, almost pleading in a way I didn't recognize. She said I had twisted an old sick man's mind against his own family. She said I would regret tearing this family apart over money. I looked at her, really looked at her, for what felt like the first time in my adult life, and I said something I'd never had the courage to say before. I said that I hadn't torn anything apart. I said that whatever had been broken in this family had been broken decades before I ever sat in a lawyer's office, broken the first time she called her own 7-year-old daughter the disappointing one, in a letter to a marriage counselor, broken every single time she chose Marcus's ambition or Renee's comfort over the truth. I said my father hadn't asked me to punish anyone. He'd only asked me to make sure the truth finally had somewhere to live where no one could talk it away. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I simply turned and walked down the courthouse steps into the gray April afternoon, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, the air felt like it belonged to me too. The months after the hearing were quieter than I expected, in the particular way that real change usually is, not a dramatic reversal, but a slow settling into a life that finally made sense. I moved back into the house on Maple Street, not as a caretaker this time, but as its owner, and I spent the first few weekends simply walking through the rooms, touching the shelves my father had built with his own hands, remembering the sound of his records playing in the evenings. Marcus tried twice to negotiate what he called a fairer arrangement, suggesting we could split things differently outside of court informally, for the sake of the family. I declined both times, gently but firmly, and told him that if he wanted to understand fairness, he could start by paying back what he still owed on the loan my father had quietly documented for years. He never brought it up again. Renee sent a card eventually months later, not quite an apology but something close to one, admitting that she hadn't realized how much you actually did for Dad, and that she was sorry things got complicated. I appreciated it more than I expected to, not because it fixed anything, but because it was the first honest sentence she'd sent me in over a decade. My mother and I speak occasionally now, careful, brief conversations that never quite become warm but no longer carry the particular cruelty I grew up bracing for. I don't know if she's changed. I don't think people change as dramatically as we sometimes hope they will, especially not after 70 years of believing their version of events was the only one that mattered. But something shifted the day that recording played in that courtroom. Some illusion she'd maintained about herself finally cracked in front of witnesses, and I think in her own quiet way she's still trying to figure out what to do with that crack. I kept the storage unit items, my grandmother's paintings, a few pieces of her jewelry, small things that connected me to a woman I barely remembered, but who my father clearly loved enough to protect her memory from being sold off and forgotten. I hung one of the paintings in the front hallway of the Maple Street house, right where you see it the moment you walk in, a small, unremarkable landscape of a lake at sunset that my father must have looked at 1,000 times as a child in that same house. Some evenings, when the light comes through the front windows just right, I sit in my father's old chair in the study, the same chair where I used to help him sort through what I thought was old paperwork, and I think about how long he must have carried all of it, the hurt of watching his wife favor 2 of his children while quietly dismissing the third, the frustration of a body that no longer cooperated with what his mind wanted to say, the determination, even as everything else grew harder, to make sure that one day, someone would finally know the truth of what he'd seen all along. I used to think being called the family failure was the worst thing that ever happened to me. I understand now that it was simply the story my family needed to tell in order to avoid looking honestly at themselves, and that the people who repeat a story the loudest are often the ones most afraid of what happens if it stops being believed. My father never once, in 5 years of quiet afternoons, called me a failure. He called me stubborn sometimes, when I refused to let him struggle alone with something he insisted on doing himself. He called me his steady one more than once, usually late in the evening, When the house was quiet and the day's frustrations had settled into something calmer. And in the end, in a courtroom on a gray Thursday morning, in his own recorded voice, slower than it used to be but entirely unmistakably his, he called me seen. I think if you've made it this far in a story like mine, you probably know what it feels like to be underestimated by the very people who are supposed to know you best. I want you to hear this the same way I finally heard it, sitting in that overheated courtroom with my hands finally still. Whatever version of you the people closest to you have decided to believe, it doesn't have to be the truth. Sometimes the truth takes longer to arrive than we'd like. Sometimes it takes a letter, sealed for months, waiting for exactly the right moment to be read out loud. But when it finally does arrive, it has a way of making up for lost time all at once. I sit in the front row now whenever it matters. Nobody tells me otherwise anymore. And some evenings, in the quiet of that old house on Maple Street, I swear I can still hear one of my father's records playing softly from the study, the way it used to, the way it always will in my memory, and I think wherever he is, he finally got to say what he needed to say. And so, in my own way, quiet and unhurried exactly like him, did I.